Well, hello everyone. My name is Cynthia Jenkins. I'm the owner and principal consultant at Elevated HR Consulting. And we work with small businesses that either don't have an HR department or just need additional HR expertise. And one thing I've learned working with small businesses is that most compliance issues don't happen because business owners are trying to do something wrong, right? They happen because everyone is busy wearing multiple hats, or because they simply don't know what's compliant and what's not. So today, I'm going to share 5 areas where I see businesses get into trouble the most often, and more importantly, some simple things you can do to avoid those headaches. So we're going to get started with a quick show of hands. If any of these apply to you, feel free to raise your hand or just make a mental note of it. So if you've hired an employee in the last year, if you don't have a dedicated HR person, if you've ever Googled an HR question because you weren't quite sure what the answer was, or if you're unsure what should go in a personnel file. For all of you that made a mental note or raised your hand, this presentation is for you. And this is actually why I love working with small businesses. Most owners aren't HR experts, right? They're experts in things like construction, law, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, or whatever industry they're in. So HR becomes one of those responsibilities that usually gets added to your already full plate, right? Sound familiar? The good news is you don't need to memorize hundreds of employment laws to avoid most problems. So let's get started with mistake number 1, hiring without a process. Small mistakes during hiring can create big problems later. It may seem like just paperwork, but if an applicant ever files a discrimination claim or someone questions your hiring decision, your documentation becomes your best defense. So keep applications, even for candidates you don't hire. A lot of business owners think they can throw away applications from people that they didn't hire. But actually, there are federal and state record retention requirements, and those applications may become important if your hiring decisions are ever challenged. Take objective interview notes. Your notes should document facts, not opinions. Instead of writing something like, didn't seem like they'd fit in because they didn't have a great personality. Maybe write something measurable, such as candidate had no experience with QuickBooks, or candidate was unable to answer questions about customer service. And always, always, always avoid discriminatory notes like comments about age, race, gender, pregnancy, or anything of the like. Use consistent interview questions. If candidate A is asked one set of questions and candidate B is asked something completely different, it's much harder to show that everyone was evaluated fairly. Having a standard interview guide helps keep things consistent and defensible. And then retain hiring records, applications, resumes, interview notes, scoring sheets. Keep all these things together and retain them according to applicable record retention requirements, which may vary by state and federal. If someone ever asks why you hired one person over the other, you should have documentation to support your decision. How many of you have heard, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen? It's true, and all of us HR professionals will tell you so. Good hiring documentation protects your business long before there's ever a problem. All right, mistake number 2. I have a question for you. How many of you have one employee file where you keep everything? It usually looks like a manila folder that has hundreds of papers, maybe paper clipped and binder clipped together, and it's really thick. Yep, that's what I see all the time. One folder with everything stuffed inside. And it's actually very common, but it's not compliant. There are several different types of employee records, and they should be kept separately because different laws govern who can access them and when. So your personnel file should contain things like employment applications, performance reviews, disciplinary documentation, promotions, training records. But then you should have a separate medical or confidential file to include items such as doctor's notes, ADA accommodation paperwork, leave documentation, workers' compensation medical information, or drug test results. Then your I-9 forms should be stored separately from personnel files as well. Finally, your payroll records should also be maintained separately since they contain wage and tax information. So if you did the math there, you could potentially have up to 4 separate files for each employee, although I typically recommend that I-9 forms be kept in one confidential file. You can have one I-9 file for all of your employees. So if you have that one file for everything, this is a great place to start improving your compliance. Mistake number 3. Many business owners believe that if they pay someone a salary, they no longer have to pay overtime. Even more business owners don't know who should be paid salary and who should be hourly. To properly classify an employee, you have to meet 2 specific tests: the salary test and the duties test. And to be legally exempt, it's not enough that they're paid on a salary basis. They also have to be paid a minimum salary threshold, kind of like minimum wage, but for salary. And their primary job duties must also meet specific exemption criteria under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And here's an important tidbit: titles don't determine exemption status. Job duties do. So for example, someone with the title office manager may or may not qualify as exempt depending on what they actually spend most of their day doing. If they're primarily performing clerical duties with no signing rights or any say-so over how the business is run, they probably don't meet the applicable exemption tests and would still be entitled to overtime. So I want to give you a real-life story before we move on. Several years ago, I worked as the HR manager for a service company that had about 20 some odd employees who worked long hours, and it was manual labor. Their job duties were very, very manual. When I came on board and first started running payroll, I noticed that all of their installers were being paid a set salary regardless of how many hours they worked. And since service installers don't perform any executive, administrative, or sales duties that could make them fall under the FLSA exemption, I knew that they should be hourly workers. But my boss at the time insisted that it was industry standard and we didn't need to make any changes. Well, fast forward about a year, and a former employee filed a claim stating he was due overtime because he worked 50 to 60 to even 70 hours a week. After review, the lawyers determined immediately that the claim was valid and that this employee was misclassified and owed back wages. So, of course, we settled, and that settlement was roughly $34,000. But guess what? People talk. And so once that employee received their settlement check, guess what he did? He told other employees. And guess what they did? They filed claims. Long story short, this small business ultimately settled 9 misclassification claims totaling well over $250,000. So my advice is simple. Whenever you hire a new position or make position changes, have someone review the classification before you implement it. It's much easier and far less expensive to get it right on the front end. Mistake number 4. Here's another question for you. How many of you have ever had an employee where you thought, maybe it'll just get better? Or maybe you said, they're a really good person and I just don't want to have that negative conversation with them. Business owners are human. Most people don't enjoy uncomfortable conversations, so it's easy to convince ourselves that a problem will just resolve on its own. And sometimes it does. Most of the time, it doesn't. One of the biggest misconceptions about documentation is that it's only for employees you're planning to fire. And that's simply not true. Good documentation is really about communication. It helps employees understand what's expected, where they're succeeding, and where they need to improve. And when expectations are clear, employees are much more likely to succeed. One of the phrases I use with clients all the time is documentation tells the story. If 6 months from now someone asks what happened with an employee, your documentation should tell that story without you having to rely on memory. So what should be documented, you ask? Always think about documenting things like attendance patterns, performance concerns, coaching discussions, policy violation, corrective actions, even performance things that are really good. Document everything. I've never had a client call me and say, Cynthia, we just documented too much. But I've had plenty call and say, man, I really wish we would have written that down. Mistake number 5. Here's another question if you're brave enough to respond. How many of you know exactly when your employee handbook was last updated? If your answer is, I think we have a handbook somewhere, you're definitely not alone. I can't tell you how many times I've been given a handbook that's over 10 years old, or one that's downloaded from the internet and never customized for the business. You know the type, right? When you see insert company name all throughout the document. The problem is, your workplace isn't the same as the person sitting next to you. And it probably doesn't even look the same as it did a few years ago. Think about everything that's changed recently. Remote and hybrid work, AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude, electronic communications, social media, changes to leave laws, workplace conduct. If your handbook hasn't changed, there's a good chance that it's no longer keeping up with your business. And your handbook does more than just tell employees the rules. It creates consistency. And does anyone happen to know what the first thing a company is usually asked for when a claim is filed against them? Or maybe the DOL is needing something? Right, your handbook. So if it's been more than a year or two since you've reviewed your handbook, or if your business has changed significantly, it's probably time for a review. And you don't necessarily need to start over. Sometimes a few strategic updates can make a big difference. So I've given you the 5 most common mistakes I see, but what can you do about it? The good news is that you don't have to tackle everything at once. If you set aside just 30 minutes this week, you can probably make a big difference. So think about things like, are your employee files organized correctly? Take a look at your personnel files. Are your documents organized? Are required forms where they should be? Having organized employee files not only saves time, but it also makes responding to audits, unemployment claims, or employee issues much easier. Are all employees classified correctly? Review who's classified as exempt and non-exempt. Remember, paying someone a salary doesn't automatically make them exempt from overtime. Make sure you're meeting both the salary and the duties test. Is our handbook up to date? If your handbook hasn't been reviewed in the last year or two, it's probably worth pulling it off the shelf. Employment laws change, your business changes, and your handbook should reflect your current policies and practices. Are you documenting consistently? You don't have to document every conversation, but you should definitely be documenting performance concerns, attendance issues, and disciplinary actions. Good documentation protects both the employees and the business. And then, is our hiring process consistent? Are candidates completing the same application? Are you asking consistent interview questions? Are hiring decisions documented? Consistency helps reduce risk and create a better hiring experience. All right, I'll leave you with this thought. Small improvements today can prevent big problems tomorrow. HR compliance isn't about being perfect. It's about being intentional, proactive, and making steady improvements over time. Thank you all so much for having me today and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about HR compliance. If there's one thing I hope you take away from today, it's that good HR doesn't have to be complicated. It really comes down to having strong people practices, being consistent, and addressing things before they become bigger problems. And if you leave here today thinking, okay, I probably need to take a closer look at some of this, that's what we're here for. Elevated HR works with small businesses to provide practical HR support without necessarily needing a full-time HR person. Our contact information is here, and I'd love to be a resource for you, whether you have a quick question, need help cleaning up your HR practices, or need ongoing support. Again, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.